Welcome to Military Analytics, Russian Army's entire order. As a result of the counter-operations launched by the Ukrainian army, Russian soldiers began to surrender. This is causing new problems. The crisis in Russia is deepening as a result of the surrender of Russian soldiers. Before we dwell on the details of this crisis, there are some questions we need to answer. What is going on in the Russian army, which claims to be the most powerful army in the world? What is the truth behind the surrender of Russian soldiers? First of all, let's be clear. Russia is ruled by an oppressive regime. Putin, who claims to love his nation, is leading his own people into poverty and death. No democratic institution in Russia is functioning properly. The Russian people want this war to end as soon as possible. But Putin's government insists on continuing the war because Putin needs this war to preserve his power. So what is the connection between this war and Putin's preservation of power? Putin has ruled Russia for 23 years. During this time, Putin has increased his repressive policies and has become increasingly authoritarian. This situation also affected the Russian economy very badly. Inflation has risen in Russia and the Russian people have started to react against Putin. Putin chose to increase the tension in the country in order to unite the Russian people. He chose an easy target and attacked Ukraine. Putin wanted to show his power to the whole world by winning an easy victory in Ukraine. Success in this war was especially important to regain the respect of the Russian people. But Putin's dreams did not come true. The whole Russian people are trying to wake up from a big nightmare after the failure in Ukraine. Putin realized that the Russian army was in a very inadequate state. The mobilization decision he announced to solve this problem is still being debated. The 300,000 soldiers that Putin forced into the army with this decision do not want to fight. That's why Russian soldiers started to surrender en masse. In point of fact, for conscripted soldiers, surrender was their very last option. Before that, they experimented with a variety of other approaches. The first one was not even going to be required to serve in the military. Following the announcement that the military would be mobilized, millions of Russian citizens left their country, particularly those who could have been drafted into the armed forces, made a hasty escape. They eluded capture by fleeing on bicycles, in boats, on the choices of trucks, and even on cargo ships. The reputation of Russia suffered a great deal as a result of these images. However, not everyone was so fortunate as to get away unscathed. Conscripts who were against their will attempted to flee from military bases. A total of approximately 200 soldiers are said to have deserted their post at the training camp in Belgorod. In addition, Russian soldiers on patrol in the Luhansk region secretly changed into civilian clothes and never went back to the army on their respective social media accounts. The Russian soldiers each related to details of how they had evaded capture. The Russian public displayed a significant amount of interest in the stories of these soldiers' escapes. Russian soldiers did something even more fascinating. Mutinies broke out at a number of Russian military bases as a direct consequence of these revolts. A great number of generals were removed from their positions. There was not even the tiniest shred of hierarchy left in the Russian armed forces. The Russian army didn't experience its true, though, until much later. The moment Russian soldiers caught sight of the Ukrainian army, they promptly raised the white flag. Because Russian soldiers surrendered while flying the white flag, Russia was forced to give up a significant number of its bases. The Russian soldiers that surrendered were given excellent treatment by the Ukrainian administration. A Russian soldier who had to surrender recorded in a video in which he discussed his experiences after doing so. According to the soldier, they are provided with really good treatment. In the footage, a Russian soldier can be heard saying, "This place provides us with hot meals and mattresses. They are really comfy. The conditions at this base are significantly more favorable. Those at the Russian base, nobody yells at us and I don't have to follow the absurd commands given by the superiors." The video showing a Russian serviceman rapidly went viral within the Russian armed forces following the playback of this move. Thousands of Russian soldiers made the decision to surrender. The Ukrainian army is quite active in this dissemination of video footage showing the capitulation of Russian troops. The Ukrainian army is continuously monitoring the Russian army from the air, using unmanned aerial vehicles and recording videos of their movements. The Ukrainian army is one that is giving the press information on all of the Russian army's shortcomings. These photographs shed light on the incompetence that permits the Russian armed forces. A brand new video was released today by the Ukrainian General Staff. The Russian soldier appears to become aware of the drones that are tracking him at some point throughout this film. The Russian soldier then exhibits a significant amount of panic. The soldier raises both hands into the air and moves forward in a deliberate manner. The drones did not stop following the Russian soldier right up until the moment that he handed himself up to the Ukrainian troops. These pictures garnered a lot of attention on various social media platforms. Every day, more and more Russian soldiers relinquish their weapons. White flags have been hoisted in place of their Russian counterparts atop numerous of Russia's military installations. The Russian army has lost control of numerous districts thanks to their own incompetence. The blue and red hues that are featured on the Russian flag are not seen very often these days. The majority of Russian military installations fly the white flag. One other advantage for Ukraine stems from the Russian soldiers' decision to surrender. A significant number of Ukrainian government employees have been held hostage by Russia in the occupied regions of Ukraine territory. It is necessary for the Ukrainian army to engage in prisoner exchanges in order to free these detainees. The Ukrainian army is currently engaging in a prisoner exchange using the Russian soldiers who have surrendered. Therefore, the Ukrainian military gains a significant advantage as a result of Russian soldiers' decision to surrender. The reputation of the Russian army has suffered significant damage as a result of the surrender of Russian army soldiers. The assertion that the Russian military was the most powerful in the world was nothing but a fairy tale made up by Russia. The Russian people have now awakened to the reality of the situation as a result of the historic resistance of the Ukrainian army. The overwhelming loss in Russia has also left a sour taste in the mouths of the Russian people. Putin had the intention of regaining the reputation that he had lost, but now he is truly embarrassed. Putin's status in Russia has significantly declined in recent years. The political career of Vladimir Putin, according to the opinions of experts, is nearly at an end. What are your thoughts on the soldiers in Russia giving up their weapons and surrendering? In what ways, in your opinion, does the surrender of soldiers change the trajectory of the war? What are your thoughts on the dissatisfaction that the Russian people have expressed? What do you think the effects of this war will be on the administration of Vladimir Putin? The Ukrainian army is approaching Crimea step by step. Both armies are now able to conduct ground operations, but the current situation of the armies does not ensure the continuity of these operations. Ukraine has stated at every opportunity that its ultimate target since the beginning of the war has been Crimea, and that its attempts towards it continue. One of the biggest obstacles to the Crimean offensive is the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The firepower of the fleet cannot be underestimated, and all the ships in the fleet are equipped with long-range cruise missiles. In light of this information, the Ukrainian army has accelerated its attacks against the Russian Black Sea Fleet this week. Explosions occurred in the Sevastopol port in the temporarily occupied Crimea in the morning hours yesterday. Ukraine has launched drone strikes near Sevastopol in recent weeks. According to the pro-Russian governor of the city of Crimea, Ukrainian underwater drones attacked Russian Navy ships in Sevastopol. Pro-Russian officials in Crimea at least reported that swarms of Ukrainian drones attempted to attack the Russian Navy this week. They follow up on other attacks north of Crimea, which Kiev insists it will retake from Russian control. The attack on the Russian naval base in Sevastopol came after the airstrike on the Saki airfield area in Crimea after the Russian train was blown up by an airstrike in Shanky and the Russian structures were blown up in Simferopol. Ukrainian Navy drones and surface amphibious drones had tried to hit the coastal base in Sevastopol. The Russian Navy in the Crimea reported that at least 3 objects were destroyed, and the Navy crews fired at them with small arms and the air defense was working. It was also stated that the Russian warships were not damaged in any way. But the Ukrainian chief of staff argues the opposite. Pro-Russian Governor Ras Vasilyev said our fleet repelled a service drone attack early this morning. 3 drones have been destroyed so far. They tried to enter the bay, but our Navy men opened fire on them also. Air defenses came into play. Video of the fire, which broke out near the entrance to Sevastopol Bay, is circulating on social media, but it is unclear what exactly burned following drone attacks that allegedly hit the port city of Sevastopol. Russian forces are on high alert in occupied Crimea. Russian officials said that the Ukrainian military launched an information attack. Radio signals were cut off to spread the word that passengers on the ferries were evacuated. This is, of course, a lie, according to the Russian authorities. But according to Transport Sevastopol, passenger transport by sea has been suspended in Sevastopol. The attack demonstrates Ukraine's seriousness in retaking Crimea after 3 consecutive explosions and airstrikes in Crimea last November. The Ukrainian Navy Special Operations Forces launched an attack on the Russian Navy in Sevastopol with at least 9 amphibious surface kamikaze drones and a swarm of 11 drones. The attack in November was the first of its kind. The attacks damaged at least 3 Russian warships. Since last July, Ukrainian forces have been targeting the city, the main base of the Black Sea Fleet, with drones. Russian officials claimed that most of the drones were shot down by Russian air defense systems, but the Ukrainian chief of staff repeatedly denies this. A few days before this attack, there was also noise in Sevastopol. There was an atmosphere of panic among the people. The residents reported explosions in several districts of the city. According to the information received, an explosion occurred near the village of Perevolnoye in Simferopol district, where a coastal defense brigade of Russia's Black Sea Fleet is deployed. The explosion near the village of Perevolnoye in the Simferopol district, where the coastal defense brigade of Russia's Black Sea Fleet is deployed, is estimated to be aimed at the 126th Separate Guard Coast Defense Brigade of the Black Sea Fleet stationed there. With the attack on Sevastopol's Belbek Air Base last week, attacks on Crimea have increased considerably. At this point, the Ukrainian army prepared during the winter, gathered the necessary intelligence, and developed its strategies, especially since the first day of the war. The Ukrainian armed forces, which established an army of drones that made a difference in Ukraine, began to make a big difference in Crimea with these weapons. The effect of this big difference is witnessed by the Russian army and the Russian Navy closely. Although the attacks of the Ukrainian army against the Russian elements in Crimea have increased, these attacks wear out the Russian army but cannot make them leave Crimea. Of course, this attrition will give the Ukrainian army a great advantage in the Crimean offensive. The reasons that hold the Russian army together at the moment are no different than a thread. This thread is undoubtedly Bakhmut. If the Battle of Bakhmut is lost and that thin thread breaks, it is very likely that we will see the Russian army disintegrating. Afterwards, the target of the Ukrainian army will undoubtedly be the Zaporizhia region. The largest formation of the Russian army after the Donbass region is in the Zaporizhia, and the Ukrainian army taking control of the region means that the Russian troops take refuge in mainland Russia outside the borders of Ukraine. In addition, Melitopol, which is the most important place of Zaporizhia, is of vital importance for the Crimean offensive. That is why the Ukrainian army continued its attacks on both Crimea and Melitopol throughout the winter. As we have mentioned before, these attacks aim to inflict and wear out the Russians the most. The strategy of the Ukrainian army seems to have worked well for the Crimean offensive at this point. Another detail that works for the Ukrainian army is that the Russian troops are officially roaming like an open target and are far from secrecy. So how did the Russians in Crimea respond to these attacks? Kiev has suggested that retaking the peninsula is a priority before an attack planned later this year. An explosion occurred recently in the town of Tsankawi in the north of the peninsula. Ukraine's military intelligence agency said the Russian Kalibr cruise missiles were destroyed in an explosion while being transported by rail without assuming direct responsibility. Ukraine's defense ministry described the explosions as mysterious. Ukraine continues the process of disarming Russia, and they are preparing to free the Crimean Peninsula from Russian control. The missiles shot down were designed to be launched from the surface ships of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The guns had a range of more than 2,500 kilometers against land target and more than 375 kilometers against sea targets. The explosions have forced Russia to rethink its force posture and defense deployments in Crimea and beyond. It's also necessary to gather intelligence on Russian responses in Crimea as the Ukrainian armed forces planned future military operations there. So what kind of measures has Russia started to take for a possible Crimean attack? Russian forces on the annexed Crimean Peninsula may be preparing for a possible so-called forced evacuation. Russian officials visited homes in Crimea and asked whether the inhabitants of the households were children or elderly. The collection of this information allegedly meant that Russian forces were probably preparing for a possible so-called forced evacuation. Crimea, located in the south of mainland Ukraine, was illegally annexed by Moscow in 2014. Since then, Kiev has reiterated its commitment to reclaim the peninsula. Ukrainian media had previously reported on the possible evacuation of Crimean residents. It was reported the other day that Russia is really preparing for defensive actions in Crimea, and the infrastructure is kept in combat-ready condition. These are powerful and aviation components located on the territory of Crimea. Russian officials in Crimea said Kiev forces would not retake the peninsula under any circumstances. This is due to defensive measures taken at the behest of Russian President Vladimir Putin. It was also reported that Kremlin-backed officials in Crimea were inspecting what he described as fortification work on the peninsula. Russian sources also stated that Moscow is fortifying parts of the southern Zaporizhia region. Satellite images show an increase in Russian fortifications in Zaporizhia, as well as more barriers and trenches in the annexed Kherson region just north of Crimea. It was also alleged that primary school students in Crimea were taught melee training and combat survival. Another claim is that the Russian Education Ministry updated school curricula to include training with AK-series assault rifles and grenades, military drills and salutations, and the use of personal protective equipment. Crimea is felt today as a festering wound in Ukrainian society, as Moscow used the annexed area as a launching pad to attack Ukraine. Russia armed Crimea with the start of full-scale warfare in February 2022. Mr. Putin is aware that he cannot hold Crimea any longer. They can see this in how determined they are in the war effort of the Ukrainian army and the rhetoric of Ukrainian state officials. No matter how much the Russian army strengthens its defensive lines in Crimea and tightens its measures, they will be helpless against Ukraine's superiority of arms at the moment. The head of the Wagner Group, Prigozhin, publicly announced that they are no longer capable of sustaining such high losses and that they are going to withdraw from Bakhmut on the 10th of May. He accused the Russian Ministry of Defense and other bureaucrats of creating artificial shell shortages due to the envy towards the overshadowing success of his private military company, which makes them look bad and incompetent. This is a clear confirmation that Russian forces will not be able to symbolically establish full control over Bakhmut by the holiday on the 9th of May, which the Ukrainian high command commanders of brigades, battalions, and just soldiers have been confidently claiming for weeks. In fact, when it comes to the movements of the front line over the last 7 days, despite absolutely brutal fights, Russian forces failed to breach Ukrainian defense as Russians reached the so-called citadel, which is the biggest residential area consisting of 10-story buildings. Russian forces would either incur massive losses by trying to storm it directly from the east, or they would incur massive losses by getting into a crossfire in trying to move around. On top of that, Ukrainians continue conducting devastating tank raids, preventing Russians from consolidating control over the approximate positions. The Ukrainian fighters published a video of how two tanks approached Russian positions from two sides and within minutes completely obliterated several buildings at once. With automatic loaders, two tanks can deliver 125mm high explosive shells every 3 to 5 seconds. Those who survive such a raid are usually finished by snipers who can control the whole perimeter by establishing positions in the citadel. Recently, Russians tried to advance along the western edge. But here, Ukrainians also have powerful positions. And as fighters from the 93rd Mechanized Brigade show, the overwhelming fire on Wagner's flanks can quickly hold their assault and prevent rapid and deep penetrations once the enemy is immobilized. Artillery and mortar crews help to eliminate the stationary attackers. However, the fighting is not easy. Ukrainian fighters continue to say that the biggest problem continues to be Russian artillery. After a week of futile ground assaults, Russians decided to burn everything to the ground. The footage released just several hours ago shows that the whole residential area is under the attack of incendiary munitions. On the other hand, we have already seen a lot of similar attacks on Volodar, even though some buildings catch on fire if an incendiary granule gets inside a flat. The main target of this strikes is likely Ukrainian equipment and driving between different parts of the western part of the town. Very often the vehicles are parked just next to the house under a camouflage netting. This track once again raised suspiciousness about the genuineness of Prigozhin's claims, as Ukrainian fighters are constantly experiencing heavy shelling. Many don't play Prigozhin's claims and speculate that he is pursuing other interests. Some speculate that he is just trying to attract more attention to his company and gain more recruits and therefore money. Others said that he has political ambitions and wants to replace the Ministry of Defense, if not the current president. And some also say that he just failed to fulfill his promises to take Bakhmut by the 9th of May and is trying to deflect the blame and save his reputation. However, many things can be true simultaneously. First of all, after today's other video where he showed 100 fresh corpses of his soldiers, and specifically named Shoigu Gerasimov and the rest of the Ministry of Defense, calling them all the bad words known to Manuel, it is highly unlikely just attention-seeking and marketing. No one has ever said so many bad things about those at the top and seen a happy retirement, let alone during the war. Secondly, even though Ukrainians indeed experienced heavy shelling, there are still successfully preventing Russians from advancing exactly what Prigozhin complains about. Prigozhin wanted several times more shells not to allow Ukrainians keep their head up so that he could make some advancements in the citadel. Thirdly, Prigozhin has been raising the alarm about the fact that Ukrainians might be preparing to conduct a massive flank attack and that he is not satisfied with the quality of the defense today. He also said that Russian bureaucrats are once again exaggerating the number of troops on the flanks in order to submit good reports, while in his experience, the flanks are barely holding. He also emphasized multiple times that in the event of a breakthrough, Wagner forces in Bakhmut would be surrounded and eliminated. And coincidentally, yesterday we discussed precisely how Ukrainians are increasing the intensity of fights in the reverse direction, relocating their tanks, and possibly preparing for a large-scale offensive operation. This also fits very well into the Ukrainian narrative that is increasingly circulating information about an unspecified surprise for Russians and in particular Wagner forces. In this direction, Prigozhin has his own intelligence. He probably anticipates it as well and decided to give up Bakhmut and escape the encirclement. It looks like he planned to kill two birds with one stone, take Bakhmut, and then escape. But the internal undermined his efforts by creating artificial shell shortages, which resulted in unsustainable losses and left him with two choices. He can either continue pushing with the last man and see whether they die before or after Ukrainians take Bakhmut into a pocket, or he can save the last Manuel. Get out of there before it is too late, and as a bonus, save his reputation. When it comes to such monumental news with far-reaching implications, it is extremely important to make sure that the information is not warped. In this case, I just watched the video with Andrei Prigozhin and with his speech regarding withdrawal. But if there were no video, the first thing I would do is to make sure that it was covered by at least a dozen of reputable sources. The second thing I do is to evaluate the bias of this story, because right-leaning outlets tend to amplify bad news and negative aspects of dealing with Ukraine, while left-leaning outlets tend to do the opposite.